Beyond the empire of the pharaohs, where the Nile carved its path through granite barriers and golden sands stretched toward distant mountains, lay a land that would challenge kings and birth kings in equal measure. The ancient Greeks called it Ethiopia, meaning burnt faces. The people of the Delta knew it as Ta Seti, the land of the bow, acknowledging the deadly accuracy of its archers. But its true name echoed in the local tongue itself, Kush, a word that would thunder across the ancient world for 3,000 years. The Nile's voice changed here. 6 granite barriers forced the mighty river into violent rapids, each a thunderous cascade of white foam and polished stone. These natural fortifications served as both obstacle and opportunity. Traders hauling precious cargo between the African interior and Mediterranean markets faced treacherous portages, but whoever controlled these choke points commanded the flow of wealth itself. Precious metals sparkled in the eastern hills. The Wadi Alaki and Wadi Gabgaba held veins of treasure that northern rulers would covet for millennia. Copper deposits provided material for tools and blades. Iron ore waited in massive quantities for future technological revolutions. This geological treasury would fund kingdoms and fuel conflicts across the ancient world. The earliest inhabitants understood their land's dual nature. By 3500 BC, A-group communities developed sophisticated pottery traditions and burial customs that reflected growing social complexity. Red and black ceramics emerged from local kilns, with geometric patterns that would influence traditions throughout the Nile Valley. Northern imports appeared alongside locally crafted goods in elite graves, evidence of commercial relationships that predated any organized state upstream. Unification under the first dynasties around 3100 BC transformed the southern frontier. Early kings launched expeditions beyond the First Cataract, seeking treasure, ivory, and exotic animals. Local communities found themselves caught between opportunity and threat as northern authority expanded southward. Some chiefs welcomed foreign goods and gradually adopted downstream customs. Others retreated deeper into the desert or fortified their villages against intrusion. The C group, flourishing from 2300 to 1550 BC, represented a more sophisticated response to these pressures. These cattle-herding peoples developed impressive metallurgical skills, creating bronze tools and blades that rivaled northern craftsmanship. Their pottery achieved remarkable artistic heights. Vessels with paper-thin walls decorated in intricate red, white, and black patterns. Ritual containers took the form of animals, reflecting the central role of livestock in local society. But the most remarkable development unfolded around the settlement at the Third Cataract. Here, local chiefs began constructing monuments that would dwarf anything previously seen in their homeland. The Eastern Defufa, a massive mud brick structure, rising over 18 meters above the surrounding plain, dominated the landscape like a man-made mountain. This architectural marvel required unprecedented organization, thousands of workers shaping millions of mud bricks and arranging them in carefully planned courses. The finished structure served multiple functions: religious center, administrative headquarters, and symbol of royal authority. Its towering presence announced to every traveler that they had entered the domain of a kingdom capable of monumental achievements. The western Defufa, constructed centuries later, housed workshops where craftsmen produced luxury goods for both local consumption and international commerce on an industrial scale. The city's rulers surrounded themselves with symbols of growing dominance. Royal graves contained beds inlaid with ivory and ebony, precious metal jewelry displaying sophisticated metalworking techniques, and arms including bronze daggers with elaborate handles. The practice of human sacrifice at royal funerals revealed the absolute authority these kings commanded. When a ruler died, hundreds of retainers followed him into the afterlife, guards taking positions around the burial chamber, servants arranging themselves in death as they had in life. Commercial networks centered on this third cataract kingdom extended in all directions. Caravans departed southward into the African interior, returning with ivory, ebony, ostrich feathers, and exotic animals. Eastern routes connected with Red Sea ports where goods from Arabia and India arrived for redistribution. Northward, despite periodic conflicts, business relationships flourished as northern demand for southern treasure remained insatiable. This wealth funded technological innovations that gave the kingdom decisive military advantages. Local bowyers developed composite bows of unprecedented strength and accuracy. These arms, constructed from carefully selected woods and reinforced with sinew and horn, could drive arrows through northern armor at distances that rendered chariots ineffective. Foreign texts acknowledged this superiority with grudging respect, referring to the land as Ta Seti, land of the bow. Bronze working reached sophisticated levels in royal workshops. Master smiths created blades, tools, and artistic objects that displayed technical mastery. Bronze mirrors reflected light like captured sunlight. Ceremonial vessels bore decorative motifs, combining downstream influences with distinctly local traditions. The urban center supported tens of thousands of inhabitants through innovative irrigation techniques adapted to the Nile's unpredictable behavior at the rapids. As the southern kingdom's influence grew, a remarkable ruler emerged who would transform regional politics forever. King Aspelta's predecessor, known to history only through fragmentary inscriptions, launched the first systematic military campaigns against the weakening Middle Kingdom. His bronze-tipped spears pierced through the ranks of northern infantry who had never faced such disciplined archery volleys. Village after village fell as his forces pressed northward, their composite bows cutting down defenders before they could close for hand-to-hand combat. The king's personal bodyguard consisted of 300 elite archers, each man capable of driving an arrow through a copper shield at 50 paces. These warriors wore leather armor, reinforced with bronze plates, and carried curved swords forged in the royal workshops. Their commander, a giant of a man whose scars told stories of countless battles, had earned his position by single-handedly defending a caravan against 20 bandits in the eastern desert. Diplomatic relations fluctuated between cooperation and conflict as southern influence expanded. During the Middle Kingdom period, northern rulers attempted to establish direct control through military expeditions and massive stone fortresses at strategic points. But the Third Cataract Kingdom's leaders proved resilient opponents. When garrisons restricted commerce, local kings developed alternative routes. When tribute was demanded, they countered with diplomatic marriages and defense agreements that preserved independence while maintaining profitable relationships. The collapse of centralized authority around 1650 BSC created an unprecedented opportunity. As northern strength fragmented during the Second Intermediate Period, southern armies pressed beyond traditional frontiers. Archaeological evidence reveals local cultural materials appearing far north of the First Cataract, suggesting the kingdom's influence extended deep into upper regions. The most dramatic moment came during the reign of a king whose name has been lost to history, but whose achievements echo through the ages. His invasion force of 10,000 warriors, 8,000 archers, and 2,000 spearmen sailed north in a fleet of war galleys, each carrying 50 fighters. The ship's prows were carved with lions' heads, their hulls painted red and black in the royal colours. Drummers on each vessel beat rhythms that synchronized the rowers' strokes and struck terror into enemy hearts. When the fleet reached Thebes, the spiritual heart of northern civilization, the city's defenders found themselves facing an unprecedented threat. Local garrison troops, accustomed to fighting bandits and raiders, confronted disciplined formations of professional soldiers whose archery skills had been honed through generations of warfare. The siege lasted 3 months. Each dawn brought fresh volleys of arrows that cleared the walls of defenders. Each night brought silent infiltrations that eliminated sentries and opened gates. The final assault came at sunrise on the feast day of Amun. Southern warriors poured through breached walls, while their archers provided covering fire from captured towers. The governor's palace fell within hours. For the first time in centuries, foreign conquerors ruled from the same chambers where the greatest monarchs had held court. Scribes recorded the remarkable reversal in hieroglyphic inscriptions that proclaimed a new age. The barbarian kingdom had not only resisted northern domination, but actually reversed it, conquering the conquerors in their own heartland. The southern king established his court in the ancient palace, but he ruled with remarkable wisdom. Rather than destroying local temples, he restored them. Instead of massacring the priesthood, he appointed himself as Amun's chosen champion. Local nobles who submitted kept their estates. Merchants who accepted the new order found their businesses protected. This pragmatic approach transformed military conquest into lasting political integration. For a generation, southern kings ruled northern territories with a combination of military strength and cultural sensitivity. Royal workshops produced ceremonial objects blending downstream techniques with homeland aesthetics. Temple reliefs depicted monarchs wearing both northern and southern regalia, emphasizing their dual role as heirs to ancient tradition and champions of regional independence. Religious syncretism flourished as northern gods found places in southern temples alongside traditional deities. Amun, the great god of Thebes, became particularly important in royal ideology. International relationships extended far beyond the Nile Valley. Commercial connections reached Mesopotamian cities, where local treasure commanded premium prices. Diplomatic correspondence from ancient archives reveals that the kingdom's rulers maintained regular communication with leaders throughout the ancient Near East, providing access to technological innovations and luxury goods while enhancing international prestige. But this period of prosperity contained the seeds of future challenges. The very success that elevated the southern kingdom above its neighbors attracted the attention of resurgent northern dynasties. As the second intermediate period ended and unified authority revived under the 18th dynasty, the Third Cataract realm faced opponents with superior numbers, advanced military technology, and unshakable determination to reclaim control over the treasure mines. The final confrontation would reshape the entire region's political landscape. Yet the cultural achievements, technological innovations, and political concepts developed during this remarkable rise would survive military defeat to influence the next chapter in southern history. The kingdom that had briefly conquered northern lands would eventually produce rulers of its own, who would claim the ancient throne, carrying forward traditions forged in the workshops and temples of the great city at the rapids. As the sun set on independence around 1500 BC, the foundations had been laid for an even more extraordinary future. The treasure would continue to flow, the archers would maintain their deadly skills, and the dream of southern greatness would endure through centuries of foreign domination, to emerge triumphant when black monarchs would rule from Memphis to Meroe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Third Cataract as Thutmose I's war galleys emerged from the river mist. 50 vessels strong, their bronze-reinforced prows gleaming like spear points. The fleet carried 8,000 seasoned veterans who had already conquered the Levant and subdued rebellious Syrian princes. At the flagship's bow stood the pharaoh himself, his golden Uraeus serpent catching the dawn light, as he gazed upon the walls of the great city that had dared to rule his ancestors' sacred Thebes. The siege lasted 47 days. Wave after wave of infantry stormed the mud-brick ramparts while engineers undermined the foundations with pick and fire. The defenders fought with desperate courage, their composite bows sending clouds of arrows into the attacking formations. But numbers told in the end. When the gates finally splintered beneath battering rams, Delta soldiers poured through the breach with the fury of men avenging a generation of humiliation. The sack marked the end of an era. Workshops that had produced masterpieces for 5 centuries went up in flames. The great defufas, symbols of independent monarchy, were stripped of their treasures and left to crumble. Thousands of captives shuffled northward in chains. Craftsmen destined for labor camps, nobles bound for temple service, children who would grow up speaking only hieroglyphic script. But Thutmose proved too clever to rule through terror alone. Having broken Kerma's military strength, he began systematic transformation of the entire territory into a model colonial province. Where fire had destroyed, construction crews would rebuild according to Memphis specifications. Where indigenous customs had flourished, administrative reforms would impose Nile Valley standards. The land between the cataracts would become not merely conquered territory, but an integral part of the expanding empire. The pharaoh appointed his own son as viceroy of Kush, creating an office that would endure for 5 centuries. This king's son commanded absolute authority over everything south of Elephantine: garrisons, building projects, mining operations, and trade networks. From his fortress palace at Aneba, the viceroy could deploy troops to any trouble spot within a fortnight's march. Stronghold construction began immediately. At Buen, on a strategic island near the Second Cataract, engineers erected walls 12 meters high and 3 meters thick. The completed installation housed 500 men plus their families, creating a permanent settlement loyal to pharaonic authority. Similar outposts arose at Semna, Kuma, and a dozen other vital points. Each controlled river traffic through its section of the waterway. Merchant vessels paid tolls. Supply convoys moved freely. Rebels found no sanctuary. The gold mines felt the heaviest hand of occupation. Where Kushite chiefs had once organized seasonal expeditions to the eastern hills, permanent work camps now operated year-round under military supervision. Thousands of prisoners, captured soldiers, condemned criminals, and tribute levies from subject tribes labored in underground galleries that honeycombed the mineral-bearing ridges. Archaeological evidence suggests some excavations reached depths of 60 meters, their tunnels supported by timber frames and ventilated through ingenious shaft systems. A typical mining camp housed 3,000 workers in stone barracks arranged around a central parade ground. Guards' quarters dominated the highest ground, their towers offering clear fields of fire across the entire installation. Beyond the walls, processing facilities crushed ore and separated precious metal, using techniques perfected in Delta workshops. Donkey caravans carried the refined product to river ports, where it joined the steady stream of wealth flowing to Memphis treasuries. Yet cultural transformation proved more complex than military conquest. The victors discovered that ruling Nubia required more than administrative efficiency and garrison troops. Indigenous traditions ran deep. Ancestral dialects persisted despite official promotion of hieroglyphic literacy. Spiritual practices adapted rather than disappeared, creating hybrid forms that honored both pharaonic gods and homeland spirits. The temple building program revealed this complexity most clearly. At Soleb, Amenhotep III erected a magnificent sanctuary dedicated to his own divine cult. But Kushite masons incorporated decorative motifs that echoed pre-conquest artistic traditions. At Said Inga, Queen Tiye's mortuary complex employed southern labor gangs who left graffiti in their native script alongside official hieroglyphic inscriptions. These monuments proclaimed pharaonic power while inadvertently preserving elements of conquered civilization. Educational policies aimed at creating a compliant elite produced unexpected consequences. Young nobles from prominent families traveled north to Memphis and Thebes for scribal training. They learned hieroglyphic writing, studied classical literature, and absorbed Egyptian religious concepts. But they also maintained connections with their homeland, returning as cultural bridges between two worlds. Some became fervent converts to pharaonic ideology. Others quietly nurtured memories of independence. Hui, who served as chief administrator during Tutankhamun's reign, exemplified the challenges of colonial administration. His tomb paintings depict tribute processions, where Kushite chiefs present exotic animals, golden ingots, and precious stones to their pharaonic overlord. Yet the same images reveal the wealth and dignity of these supposedly subject peoples. Elephant tusks tower above the bearers' heads. Leopard skins gleam with careful preservation. Jewelry displays sophisticated craftsmanship that rivaled anything produced in northern workshops. The tribute system created its own contradictions. Annual assessments demanded specific quantities of gold, ivory, cattle, and exotic goods. Appointed administrators, whether Egyptian-born officials or co-opted Nubians, faced the impossible task of extracting maximum wealth without destroying the productive capacity that generated it. Excessive demands triggered revolts. Lenient collection invited accusations of corruption. The most successful governors learned to balance competing pressures through diplomatic skill and judicious force. Trade networks evolved rather than disappeared under occupation. Caravans still departed for the African interior, but now they carried pharaonic goods alongside traditional items. Copper tools manufactured in delta workshops reached villages 1,000 kilometers upstream. Grain from northern farms fed mining camps that indigenous agriculture could not supply. Red Sea shells decorated pottery produced in Kushite kilns according to Egyptian specifications. Spiritual transformation proceeded through synthesis rather than suppression. Amun, the great god of Thebes, found a home at Jebel Barkal, an isolated sandstone mountain that Nubian peoples had considered holy for generations. The site's natural features, a towering pinnacle that seemed to pierce the sky, made it perfect for Amun's worship. But the deity who took residence there acquired distinctly Kushite characteristics that would profoundly influence future developments. The Barkal temple complex grew over centuries into the largest devotional installation south of Thebes. Successive pharaohs added halls, courts, and subsidiary buildings that transformed the original modest shrine into a sprawling, holy city. Priests trained in Egyptian seminaries conducted daily rituals according to established formulas. Yet inscriptions reveal theological concepts that blended mainstream doctrine with Nubian beliefs about divine kingship and cosmic order. As generations passed, the occupation gradually transformed from external rule into cultural integration. Soldiers who had arrived as conquerors married Kushite women and raised bilingual children. Their sons joined garrison units. Their daughters entered temple service. Administrative families developed economic interests that tied their prosperity to stability rather than extraction policies. The pottery evidence tells this story with particular clarity. Early occupation levels contain predominantly Egyptian ceramic styles, red burnished vessels, blue painted bowls, and storage jars that mimicked Delta prototypes. Later periods reveal increasing hybridization. Nubian potters adopted northern glazing techniques, but applied them to traditional shapes. Egyptian forms acquired Kushite decorative motifs. Entirely different styles emerged that belonged fully to neither tradition. Amenhotep II's military campaigns demonstrated both the strength and limitations of pharaonic control. When rebellions erupted during the early years of his reign, the pharaoh personally led punitive expeditions that devastated rebel territories. His victory stela at Amada records the execution of 7 captured princes, 6 from the Levant and 1 from Kush, whose bodies were displayed throughout the empire as warnings against future resistance. Yet these same campaigns revealed how thoroughly Nubia had been integrated into Egyptian strategic thinking. Kushite archers formed elite units in the pharaonic army. Prominent nobles commanded auxiliary forces that fought alongside Delta regulars. The conquered had become partners in further conquests, their skills and knowledge essential for maintaining empire in an increasingly complex world. The reign of Akhenaten brought spiritual revolution that affected Nubia as dramatically as it transformed Egypt. When the heretic pharaoh abandoned traditional gods in favor of Aten worship, Kushite temples faced impossible choices. Some priests embraced the monotheism, closing their sanctuaries to Amun and other ancient deities. Others maintained clandestine worship while publicly conforming to demands. A few openly defied the doctrine, triggering violent confrontations with loyalist forces. At Jebel Barkal, the Amun priesthood chose resistance. They sealed the temple's inner sanctuaries, hiding holy objects and texts in underground chambers. When Akhenaten's agents arrived to enforce the orthodoxy, they found empty halls and defiant priests who claimed divine authorization for their disobedience. The resulting conflict destroyed much of the complex, but also created an underground network of traditionalist clergy who would preserve orthodox doctrine through the years of heresy. Tutankhamun's restoration brought renewed prosperity to Nubia. The boy pharaoh lavished resources on temple reconstruction, particularly at sites associated with Amun worship. At Barkal, massive building projects expanded the complex beyond its pre-Amarna dimensions. Additional halls housed enlarged priesthoods. Expanded workshops produced ceremonial objects for increasingly elaborate rituals. The god, who had once been merely one deity among many, acquired unprecedented prominence in Kushite devotional life. But this period of renewed integration coincided with the first signs of Egyptian weakness. The Hittite wars consumed enormous resources while producing limited strategic gains. Nubian gold still flowed northward, but increasing amounts went to finance foreign campaigns rather than domestic development. Garrison troops found themselves transferred to Levantine frontiers, leaving reduced forces to maintain order in territories that had grown accustomed to overwhelming military presence. Appointed administrators gained correspondingly greater autonomy as central oversight weakened. Viceroys who had once reported regularly to Memphis now made decisions independently, their authority constrained more by practical limitations than bureaucratic supervision. Provincial governors developed personal relationships with tribal chiefs that bypassed official channels. Military commanders recruited locally rather than depending on reinforcements that arrived sporadically, if at all. The reign of Rameses II marked both the zenith and beginning of the end for Egyptian control in Nubia. The great builder pharaoh expanded temple complexes throughout the territory, most notably at Abu Simbel, where colossal statues proclaimed his divine authority to every traveler on the river. These monuments required unprecedented labor mobilization. Thousands of stonecutters, sculptors, and transport workers drawn from communities already strained by military recruitment and tribute obligations. Yet the same period witnessed the emergence of distinctly Kushite architectural styles that subtly challenged Egyptian aesthetic dominance. Nubian masons developed proportional systems that created buildings recognizably different from their northern prototypes. Indigenous sculptors carved pharaonic images that emphasized divine authority while incorporating facial features and artistic conventions that reflected homeland preferences. These innovations remained within acceptable boundaries, but established precedents for future cultural independence. The priesthood at Jebel Barkal acquired particular prominence during Ramesses' reign. Pharaonic inscriptions identify the site as the Pure Mountain, a designation that placed it on par with the most holy locations in the Egyptian heartland. The chief priest bore titles normally reserved for Theban clergy, suggesting that Barkal had achieved genuine equality with the empire's premier devotional centers. This elevation reflected both the site's growing importance and the pragmatic recognition that Kushite loyalty required respectful treatment of indigenous traditions. Commercial relationships evolved in directions that subtly undermined Egyptian economic integration. While official tribute continued flowing northward, private networks developed that connected Nubian communities directly with foreign markets. Red Sea ports handled increasing volumes of goods that bypassed traditional pharaonic intermediaries. Overland routes through the eastern desert linked gold mining areas with Arabian trading centers that offered better prices than official purchasing agents. Military recruitment policies created unexpected consequences as Kushite soldiers gained prominence in Egyptian armies. These men learned advanced tactical methods while developing personal loyalties that transcended simple provincial obedience. Veterans who returned home brought professional military knowledge that gradually improved indigenous defensive capabilities. Some established private guard units that served Nubian nobles according to traditional patterns of personal loyalty rather than bureaucratic command structures. The later Ramessid period saw increasing administrative decentralization as pharaonic attention focused on northern frontiers threatened by Sea Peoples' invasions. Nubian governors received broader authority to handle affairs without consulting Memphis. Provincial courts gained jurisdiction over matters previously reserved for pharaonic decision. Military commanders operated with discretion that approached independence. Their actions constrained more by available resources than central oversight. As the 20th dynasty struggled with succession crises and foreign invasions, Nubia experienced a gradual renaissance of traditional culture within the framework of continued Egyptian allegiance. Kushite chiefs adopted pharaonic titles while maintaining ancestral power bases. Priests conducted ceremonies that honored both Egyptian and indigenous traditions. Artists developed styles that synthesized centuries of cultural exchange into distinctly Nubian aesthetic expressions. The stage was set for the next chapter in this remarkable story. At Jebel Barkal, priests preserved devotional traditions that would soon challenge pharaonic authority in its own heartland. In fortified towns throughout Kush, noble families maintained genealogies that traced their descent from pre-conquest rulers. Among warrior bands that served as auxiliary forces in Egyptian armies, tactical knowledge accumulated that would prove decisive in future conflicts. The gold continued to flow northward, but the hands that mined it remembered older allegiances. The archers still served Egyptian commanders, but their bows recalled victories won under different banners. The temples honored pharaonic gods, but their rituals preserved concepts of divine kingship that would soon find expression in the ancient land that had once ruled pharaohs. The falcons soared above Jebel Barkal as dawn broke over the Pure Mountain. its wings catching the first rays of sunlight that would illuminate the most audacious campaign in African history. In the shadow of the towering sandstone pinnacle, 10,000 warriors knelt in prayer before their king. The descendant of chiefs who had once served foreign masters, now prepared to march north and claim the throne of pharaohs as his birthright. The dream had begun a generation earlier, when his father Kashta first adopted the double crown and declared himself king of upper and lower realms from his palace at Napata. But dreams required blood and bronze to become reality. Spies had watched the northern kingdom tear itself apart through decades of civil war. The delta bristled with petty kings who squabbled over trade routes as Libya's descendants ruled the ancient capital through corruption and compromise. The sacred office that had once directed the known world lay degraded in the hands of men who cared more for Syrian wine than cosmic order. This could not stand. Amun himself had spoken through the oracle at Barkal, directing his chosen son to march north and restore Ma'at, truth and justice, to the two lands. The god who had found refuge in Nubia during centuries of foreign domination now demanded that his faithful servants reclaim his original throne in Thebes. What mortals called conquest, the heavenly realm recognized as restoration. The Southern Army represented the culmination of 3 centuries of evolution. At its core marched the descendants of those archers who had once terrorized garrisons. Their composite bows, now reinforced with bronze fittings and strung with the finest sinew, drove arrows through armor at distances that rendered enemy cavalry helpless. Each bowman carried 60 shafts in quivers, decorated with leopard skin and ostrich feathers. Their captains bore recurved swords forged in Meroitic workshops that had perfected techniques unknown in the Mediterranean world. But the king directed more than traditional warriors. Cavalry rode horses descended from bloodlines carefully maintained since the days of occupation. These mounted archers combined the mobility of nomad raiders with the discipline of professional soldiers. They loosed arrows at full gallop, wheeled away from pursuing foot soldiers, and returned to strike exposed flanks before enemies reformed their lines. Northern armies, long dependent on unwieldy chariots that required smooth terrain and extensive support, had no answer to this fluid tactical system. The Spearman Corps consisted of Sudanese veterans whose shields bore Amun's ram's head in golden inlay. These men had trained since childhood in formations that advanced under arrow fire, closed with enemy forces, and maintained cohesion during the chaotic melee of hand-to-hand combat. Their bronze-tipped spears reached longer than northern weapons, as leather armor reinforced with metal plates provided protection without sacrificing mobility. Support elements included Beja scouts from the Red Sea Hills who tracked enemy movements across impossible terrain, Ethiopian auxiliaries whose knowledge of siege warfare had been honed in highland conflicts, an engineer corps trained in bridge building, wall scaling, and the complex logistics of moving armies through hostile territory. Supply trains carried bronze working equipment to maintain weapons, medical personnel trained in battlefield surgery, and diplomatic staff prepared to negotiate with potential allies. The march north began as the Nile reached its annual flood peak. War galleys, each carrying 40 warriors plus crew, formed a fleet that stretched for miles along the river. Advance guards secured landing points as the main force leapfrogged between established camps. Local populations, weary of decades of civil war and economic disruption, often welcomed the disciplined Southerners as liberators rather than conquerors. News of the invasion reached the ancient capital like wildfire. Tefnakht, the Libyan prince who controlled much of the delta, had been consolidating power through careful combination of pressure and diplomatic alliances. His forces had seized several strategic cities in Middle Territories, threatening the independence of Thebes itself. But reports of the approaching army forced him to reassess his priorities. The Southern King directed resources that dwarfed anything available to Delta warlords. The first major confrontation came at Heracleopolis. Tefnakt's ally, Namlot, had established a heavily fortified base. The city's walls, rebuilt according to the latest defensive principles, featured projecting towers that provided overlapping fields of fire for archers. A double moat protected the approaches, as the garrison included veteran soldiers and cavalry drawn from across the delta. Namlot confidently expected that his stronghold would withstand any assault. The siege techniques demonstrated how thoroughly Southern science had evolved beyond traditional African warfare. Rather than attempting costly direct assaults, engineers diverted river channels to flood the defensive ditches as sappers undermined the foundations of key towers. Catapults hurled firebombs over the walls to destroy supply depots and demoralize defenders. Most devastatingly, archers established shooting positions that made movement on the walls impossible during daylight hours. The siege lasted 27 days. Each morning brought fresh volleys that cleared the battlements of defenders. Each night brought infiltration attempts that eliminated sentries and opened postern gates. When the walls finally crumbled under concentrated assault, troops poured across the breaches with disciplined fury. But the king's treatment of the captured city revealed his sophisticated understanding of political warfare. Rather than sacking Heracleopolis, he restored its temples, protected its civilians, and appointed local nobles to administrative positions under southern oversight. This magnanimous policy paid immediate dividends. Cities throughout Middle Territories began opening their gates without resistance, their rulers calculating that submission offered better prospects than futile defiance. Hermopolis surrendered after a brief siege, when its prince recognized that the invader possessed heavenly authority as well as superiority. The king's inscriptions emphasized his role as Amun's chosen champion, restoration of proper religious observances, and respect for traditional customs. But the ancient capital presented a far greater challenge. The city's massive walls had been strengthened by generations of rulers who understood its strategic importance. The harbor bristled with war galleys, as the garrison included the finest troops available to Delta princes. Most importantly, this metropolis housed the legitimizing symbols of pharaonic authority, the sacred regalia, statues, and ceremonial implements that transformed conquest into rightful kingship. Tefnakt himself directed the defense, deploying 15,000 soldiers and cavalry in positions carefully chosen to maximize his advantages. The city's northern approaches were protected by canal systems that channeled attacking forces into killing grounds dominated by massed archers. The southern gates opened onto marshy ground that would bog down heavy troops, exposing them to flanking attacks from hidden reserves. The assault on the ancient capital became the masterpiece of African art. Rather than accepting the tactical disadvantages imposed by the city's defenses, the attackers created entirely different strategic conditions. Engineers constructed a massive causeway across the marshes, providing firm footing for columns protecting their flanks with palisades and archer positions. Simultaneously, the fleet forced its way into the harbor under cover of concentrated arrow fire that swept the defending galleys from their moorings. The crucial breakthrough came when Marines seized the harbor fortifications that controlled access to the commercial district. Fighting house by house along narrow streets, their archery superiority mattered less. The warriors demonstrated the hand-to-hand combat skills that generations of training had perfected. Defenders, accustomed to fighting from fortified positions, found themselves outmatched in close quarters. Combat. Southern spearmanship and swordsmanship proved decisive. Tefnacht escaped during the final assault, fleeing northward with the remnants of his army. But his flight left the capital defenseless, its gates thrown open by citizens who hoped that surrender might spare them the horrors of a sack. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented in their experience of warfare. The victor entered the city not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate pharaoh reclaiming his rightful throne. His first acts included restoring the temples, confirming existing officials in their positions, and conducting the ancient ceremonies that transformed victory into coronation. The coronation ritual followed traditions established more than 2 millennia earlier, when Menes first united the two lands. But this version incorporated southern elements that reflected the kingdom's unique heritage. Priests from Jebel Barkal participated alongside their northern counterparts, symbolizing the union of upper and lower realms under a ruler who embodied both traditions. The ceremony concluded with adoption of the full pharaonic titulary, including names that proclaimed sonship and universal sovereignty. Yet victory required political consolidation to become lasting achievement. The Delta still harbored numerous princes who possessed local loyalties and sufficient resources to challenge southern authority. Tefnacht had retreated to the western marshes. His fleet operated from hidden bases, as his allies controlled fortified cities throughout the northern territories. The conquest of the ancient capital had eliminated the symbolic center of resistance, but substantial challenges remained. The campaign to secure the Delta revealed both the strengths and limitations of southern power. Forces excelled in open warfare. Their mobility and archery devastated enemy formations. They proved equally effective in siege operations, engineering skills, and disciplined assault tactics overcame static defenses. But controlling the labyrinthine waterways and fortified islands of the Delta required different capabilities that stretched resources to their limits. The fortress of Athribis exemplified these challenges. Built on an island in the middle of the Delta's main channel, it approached only by water along narrow passages dominated by archer positions on elevated platforms. The garrison consisted of marines trained in amphibious warfare, as the surrounding marshes concealed reserve forces that struck supply convoys or isolated detachments. Conventional siege techniques proved inadequate against such obstacles. The solution demonstrated the tactical flexibility that distinguished great leaders from merely competent ones. Rather than attempting direct assault, the fleet established a blockade that prevented supplies from reaching the fortress, as troops secured all land routes to the island. Simultaneously, engineers constructed floating platforms that transported siege equipment across the waterways, under cover of concentrated arrow fire from supporting galleys. The siege lasted 4 months. Gradual starvation weakened the garrison's ability to resist, as constant pressure from multiple directions prevented effective counterattacks. When the final assault came, it struck simultaneously from land, water, and air, the latter consisting of fire arrows launched from catapults positioned on the floating platforms. The fortress fell within hours, its defenders overwhelmed by coordinated attacks that they had no means to counter. Similar operations secured the remaining Delta strongholds, though some required innovative solutions that tested southern ingenuity to its limits. At Tanis, underwater obstacles prevented galley approaches until divers cleared passages across the defensive booms. At Sais, night attacks led by Baisha scouts eliminated the sentries who guarded the city's secret water gates. At Mendes, local priests opened the temple treasuries to the forces, after recognizing legitimacy as Amun's chosen representative. The submission of Hermopolis Magna marked the effective end of organized resistance. Its ruler, Prince Nimlot, had initially allied with Tefnacht, but reversed his allegiance when victories demonstrated the futility of opposition. The prince's elaborate surrender ceremony, recorded in detail on the victory stela, established protocols that subsequent submissions would follow. Defeated rulers prostrated themselves before the pharaoh, offered tribute that demonstrated their acceptance of subordinate status, and received confirmation of their authority under southern oversight. But the greatest diplomatic triumph involved treatment of Thebes, the spiritual heart of pharaonic civilization. The city had maintained precarious independence during the preceding decades of civil war, its priesthood claiming to serve the legitimate pharaoh, avoiding commitment to any particular claimant. The arrival forced them to choose between resistance and recognition, a choice made easier by genuine devotion to Amun and restoration of proper religious observances. The Theban submission ceremony became the religious climax of conquest. The adoratress, highest-ranking priestess of Amun's cult, performed rituals that had been neglected during decades of political chaos. The sacred bark sailed forth from Karnak's innermost sanctuary as crowds lined the processional route in celebration. Ancient hymns echoed across the Nile as the king fulfilled his role as pharaoh priest, the appointed intermediary between gods and mortals. This religious dimension of rule proved crucial for long-term political stability. Unlike previous foreign conquerors who had imposed their own deities and customs, the victor presented himself as the restorer of traditional faith. His inscriptions emphasized his role in repairing neglected temples, reinstating proper rituals, and protecting the priesthood from political interference. This conservative approach appealed to populations weary of innovation and experimentation. The administrative system that emerged reflected this balance between central authority and local autonomy. Southern governors controlled key strategic points: the ancient capital, Thebes, and the major fortress cities. Egyptian nobles retained authority over their hereditary domains under pharaonic oversight. Tax collection, legal administration, and religious observances continued according to established precedents, but now served a monarchy based in Napata rather than the northern capital. Integration proved more complex. Northern foot soldiers lacked the mobility and archery skills that had made southern forces so effective. Sudanese cavalry required different tactical doctrines than local leaders understood. The solution involved creating mixed units that combined the strengths of both traditions. Engineers and siege specialists joined assault troops. Delta Marines served alongside river forces. Libyan cavalry learned mounted archery techniques. Cultural synthesis produced innovations that enriched both traditions. Artists working in northern studios developed styles that incorporated traditional techniques with southern aesthetic sensibilities. Pharaonic regalia acquired African decorative elements: leopard skin cloaks, ostrich feather fans, and golden ornaments that reflected the conqueror's heritage. Temple architecture began incorporating design principles that had evolved in sanctuaries during centuries of independent development. The economic integration of the two realms created prosperity that benefited both regions. Southern gold financed massive construction projects throughout the Nile Valley. Northern grain fed growing populations in the territories. Ivory and exotic African products reached Mediterranean markets, established commercial networks. The pharaoh's court at Napata became a cosmopolitan center. Diplomats from across the known world sought audiences with the ruler, who directed resources from the heart of Africa to the shores of the Mediterranean. But the ultimate achievement transcended conquest or administrative efficiency. By successfully claiming the pharaonic throne, the king had reversed the relationship between the two realms that had persisted for 8 centuries. The colonized had become colonizers, the subjects had become rulers, and the peripheral kingdom had become the center. This transformation challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and cultural superiority that had shaped ancient Mediterranean thought. The victory, stela erected at Jebel Barkol, proclaimed this achievement in language that deliberately echoed the boastful inscriptions of earlier pharaohs. But rulers had emphasized their superiority over foreign peoples. This monarch presented himself as the restorer of cosmic order, the chosen champion of justice, and the legitimate heir to traditions that transcended ethnic boundaries. His was not a foreign conquest, but a homecoming, the return of proper kingship to a land that had forgotten its obligations. As the court established itself in the ancient capital, receiving tribute from rulers who had once directed independent kingdoms, the ancient world struggled to comprehend what had occurred. African kings now ruled the oldest civilization on earth. Black pharaohs sat on thrones that had been occupied by the builders of pyramids. The gold that had once flowed northward as tribute now financed southern palaces. Sudanese nobles wore crowns that proclaimed their dominion over both Nile valleys. Yet this triumph contained the seeds of future challenges. The northern kingdom's wealth had always attracted foreign attention, and success had not escaped notice in the growing Assyrian Empire. Beyond the Sinai Peninsula, Sargon II marshaled forces that dwarfed anything previously seen in the ancient world. The age of small kingdoms and local conflicts was ending, replaced by struggles that would determine the fate of entire civilizations. For now, though, the victor savored his unprecedented achievement. The boy who had knelt in prayer beneath the pure mountain now ruled from palaces that had sheltered pharaohs for 3 millennia. His archers patrolled borders that stretched from the Fourth Cataract to the Mediterranean Sea. His priests conducted ceremonies in temples that housed gods who had blessed kings since the dawn of recorded history. The dream of southern greatness had become reality: bronze and blood, wisdom and courage, favor and human determination. As the falcon soared above the ancient capital, its shadow fell across a land united under African kingship for the first time in human memory. The thunder of Assyrian war drums had faded into memory, but their echoes still haunted the palaces of Napata. Taharka's successors gazed northward from their throne rooms, watching smoke rise from the ruins of their lost dominion. The Black Pharaohs had been driven from Memphis by Ashurbanipal's bronze-clad legions. Their dream of ruling the two lands shattered against the disciplined fury of Mesopotamian warfare. Yet in this moment of apparent defeat, the seeds of an even greater flowering lay waiting in the fertile soil of the south. 600 years before the Common Era, as Persian armies swept across the ancient world and Greek city-states squabbled among themselves, a new capital began rising beside the Sixth Cataract. The emerging metropolis grew not from necessity, but from visionary ambition, a conscious decision to build something unprecedented in African history. Here, 200 kilometers north of modern Khartoum, architects and engineers would create a city that rivaled Alexandria in its sophistication and surpassed Babylon in the diversity of its population. The site offered advantages that Napata could never match. Rich agricultural lands stretched along both banks of the Nile, watered by dependable floods and seasonal rainfall that made irrigation less critical than in the northern desert regions. Metal ore deposits in the nearby hills promised technological independence from foreign suppliers. Most importantly, the location stood at the intersection of commercial routes that connected the Mediterranean world with the heart of Africa, the Red Sea ports with the Atlantic coast, and the Nile Valley with the vast interior savannas. King Aspelta initiated the transition during the middle years of the 6th century, establishing workshops and governmental centers that would gradually eclipse the old capital's importance. His architects borrowed freely from various traditions while creating something entirely new. Palaces rose in terraced gardens, watered by ingenious hydraulic systems. Sanctuaries combined traditional concepts with architectural innovations that had never been attempted in stone. Government buildings housed bureaucracies whose sophistication would have impressed scribes in Persepolis or Babylon. The most remarkable achievement of early development was its water management system. Engineers diverted seasonal streams into carefully planned channels that fed artificial lakes scattered throughout the urban area. These hafir, enormous reservoirs lined with fired brick and sealed with bitumen, stored millions of gallons against the dry season, while serving as focal points for residential districts that housed craftsmen, merchants, and officials. The largest hafir covered nearly 40 hectares, its waters reflecting spires and towers like mirrors of polished bronze. But the true revolution lay in mastery of metallurgical technology. Furnaces that dotted the city's industrial quarters reached temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to smelt the most refractory ores and produce steel of unprecedented quality. Local smiths developed techniques for creating laminated blades that combined hard cutting edges with flexible cores, weapons that could cleave bronze armor while bending rather than breaking under stress. These innovations gave armies decisive advantages over enemies who still depended on softer metals. The economic implications transformed the entire region. Metal tools increased agricultural productivity as farmers cleared larger fields and dug deeper irrigation channels. Advanced weapons equipped larger armies without depleting the copper supplies that had limited earlier expansion. Manufactured goods, from cooking pots to ceremonial objects, found ready markets throughout Africa and the Mediterranean world. Most importantly, metallurgical independence freed the kingdom from dependence on foreign suppliers who had previously controlled access to military technology. Spiritual life in the new capital reflected the cosmopolitan influences that shaped its development. Traditional deities maintained their prominence, but they shared sanctuary space with gods imported from various cultures. Apedamak, the lion-headed war god, emerged as a distinctly local creation, a synthesis of African animal symbolism with Near Eastern concepts of divine kingship. His sanctuaries featured architectural elements unknown in other traditions: curved walls that seemed to flow like water, columns that resembled palm trees, and decorative motifs that celebrated the natural world. The indigenous script represented perhaps the civilization's most remarkable intellectual achievement. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, which had been borrowed and adapted from foreign models, this writing system emerged from purely local roots. Its cursive characters could record spoken language with precision and elegance, enabling the creation of literature that reflected the kingdom's unique cultural perspective. Official inscriptions, sacred texts, and commercial documents preserve a linguistic tradition that flourished for over 1,000 years. Palace life achieved levels of luxury that would have impressed visitors from Rome or Alexandria. Archaeological excavations reveal bathhouses with running water, heated floors, and decorated pools that rivaled the finest Roman facilities. Apartments featured wall paintings that depicted African landscapes, exotic animals, and court ceremonies in brilliant colors that modern chemistry has barely managed to recreate. Furniture inlaid with ivory, ebony, and precious metals demonstrated craftsmanship that synthesized techniques from across the ancient world. The role of women in society differed dramatically from patterns found elsewhere in the ancient world. Queens ruled in their own right, commanding armies and conducting diplomacy without male oversight. The institution of the Kandake, Queen Mother or ruling monarch, gave women access to authority that exceeded anything available to their counterparts in Greece, Rome, or Persia. These female rulers left monuments that proclaimed their achievements in terms traditionally reserved for male sovereigns. Queen Shanakda Keto, who ruled during the early 1st century before our era, exemplified this tradition. Her pyramid rivals those of any male predecessor in its scale and decorative sophistication. Relief carvings show her leading captives, receiving tribute and performing ceremonies that established her divine authority. Her name appears in cartouches that proclaim her absolute sovereignty over territories stretching from the border to the Ethiopian highlands. Commercial networks centered on the capital extended far beyond anything achieved by earlier kingdoms. Caravans departed regularly for the Red Sea ports, carrying ivory, gold, exotic animals, and manufactured goods to markets in Arabia, India, and the Far East. Archaeological evidence includes Chinese silk, Indian cotton, Roman glassware, and Persian metalwork, testimony to business relationships that spanned continents. The profits from this commerce financed public works projects that transformed the city into one of the ancient world's most impressive urban centers. The caravan business required sophisticated organization that pushed governmental capabilities to new levels. Route security demanded coordination between armies, tribal allies, and foreign governments. Commercial law developed to handle disputes between merchants from different cultures who operated under varying legal traditions. Banking systems emerged to finance long-distance expeditions whose profits might not materialize for years. Insurance arrangements protected investors against the risks of desert travel, foreign wars, and fluctuating market conditions. Industrial production achieved remarkable diversity and sophistication. Pottery workshops produced vessels that combined functional excellence with artistic beauty, their red and black ceramics decorated with geometric patterns that influenced styles throughout the Nile Valley. Textile manufacturers created cotton and linen fabrics that competed successfully with products from various regions. Leather workers crafted goods that found markets from Ethiopia to the Mediterranean. Metal workers produced both utilitarian objects and luxury items that demonstrated technical mastery and aesthetic refinement. The agricultural foundation supporting this urban prosperity depended on innovations that maximized the region's natural advantages. Farmers developed crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility while increasing yields. New varieties of sorghum, millet, and cotton were developed through selective breeding programs that improved drought resistance and nutritional value. Animal husbandry techniques produced cattle, goats, and sheep that provided meat, milk, and raw materials for manufacturing. Fishing and hunting supplemented agricultural production while providing protein for urban populations. Educational institutions trained scribes, officials, and technical specialists who maintained the kingdom's complex governmental and economic systems. Schools taught local script alongside Egyptian hieroglyphs and Greek letters, preparing graduates for careers in diplomacy, commerce, and sacred service. Medical training combined traditional African healing knowledge with techniques learned from foreign practitioners. Engineering education produced the specialists who designed and maintained the hydraulic systems that made urban life possible. Sacred architecture reached unprecedented heights during the Golden Age. The lion's sanctuary of Apedimak at Musawarat es Sufra covered several hectares, its courtyards and halls decorated with relief carvings that depicted ceremonies and divine interventions. The Amun sanctuary at Naga incorporated architectural elements from various traditions in a synthesis that created something entirely new. These monuments required organizing labor forces, transporting materials over vast distances, and coordinating craftsmen whose skills had been developed in different cultural contexts. Military organization evolved to meet the challenges of defending routes that stretched across thousands of kilometers of difficult terrain. The army combined traditional archers with cavalry units, siege specialists, and engineering corps that could construct bridges, fortifications, and siege equipment. Allied tribal forces provided irregular troops familiar with local conditions and guerrilla tactics. Foreign mercenaries brought specialized skills developed in wars throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. Diplomatic relationships during this period extended far beyond traditional African boundaries. Ambassadors maintained regular contact with Roman officials in the north, Persian governors in Arabia, and Ethiopian rulers in the highlands. Commercial treaties regulated business relationships, while military alliances provided mutual security against common threats. Marriage alliances linked the ruling family with houses throughout the region, creating networks of kinship that facilitated both diplomatic and commercial relationships. The pyramid fields around the capital preserve the most visible evidence of the kingdom's prosperity and artistic achievement. Over 200 noble tombs dot the landscape, their steep-sided monuments rising like stone mountains from the desert floor. Unlike northern pyramids, which were built primarily as eternal resting places for deceased pharaohs, these structures served as focal points for ongoing ceremonies that maintained connections between the living and the dead. Burial practices reflected the cosmopolitan influences that shaped the culture. Mummies were prepared using techniques that combined Egyptian embalming methods with indigenous preservation practices. Grave goods included objects from across the known world: Chinese bronzes, Indian gems, Roman coins, and Persian textiles alongside traditional African items. These assemblages demonstrate both the wealth that families commanded and the extensive networks that supplied luxury goods to local markets. The artistic traditions that flourished created styles that influenced aesthetic development throughout northeastern Africa. Sculptors working in stone, wood, and metal developed techniques that captured both realistic detail and symbolic meaning. Painters created wall decorations that combined traditional African motifs with influences absorbed from foreign cultures. Jewelers crafted ornaments that demonstrated technical mastery while expressing distinctly local aesthetic sensibilities. Festivals became famous throughout the ancient world for their magnificence and exotic character. The annual Lion Festival attracted visitors from various regions who came to witness ceremonies that combined spectacular pageantry with deeply meaningful spiritual content. Processions featuring hundreds of participants, exotic animals, and elaborate costumes wound through streets lined with spectators from dozens of different cultures. These events served both sacred and diplomatic functions, reinforcing the capital's position as a major center of African civilization. Scientific knowledge accumulated in local institutions influenced development throughout the region. Astronomical observations enabled the creation of calendars that predicted seasonal changes with remarkable accuracy. Medical knowledge combined indigenous healing traditions with techniques learned from foreign practitioners, creating therapeutic approaches that were remarkably effective by ancient standards. Engineering innovations in hydraulic systems, metallurgy, and construction influenced technological development throughout the Nile Valley and beyond. As the centuries passed, influence extended far beyond political boundaries. Merchants established posts throughout the Red Sea region, the Ethiopian highlands, and the western African savannas. Craftsmen found employment in foreign courts where their skills were highly valued. Soldiers served as mercenaries in armies from Ethiopia to Arabia, spreading knowledge of advanced techniques and weapons technology. The kingdom's prosperity during its golden age attracted attention from foreign powers who coveted its wealth and strategic position. Roman legions in the north eyed the rich territories to the south, while Arab tribes from the peninsula launched raids against caravan routes. Ethiopian kingdoms sought to control the highland passages, while various tribes pressed against the kingdom's traditional heartlands. Maintaining independence required constant vigilance and sophisticated diplomacy. Yet the very success that made the capital famous throughout the ancient world contained the seeds of future challenges. Prosperity attracted immigrants whose diverse cultural backgrounds gradually transformed the social structure. Economic growth created new classes whose interests sometimes conflicted with traditional authority. Technological innovations disrupted established craft traditions while creating opportunities for entrepreneurs who challenged hereditary elites. The spiritual syncretism that had initially strengthened the culture by incorporating useful elements from foreign traditions eventually created theological confusion as competing belief systems struggled for supremacy. Governmental complexity that had once demonstrated sophistication increasingly hindered effective decision-making, as bureaucratic procedures became ends in themselves, rather than means to achieve practical goals. As the 3rd century of the Common Era dawned, signs of strain were becoming apparent throughout the kingdom. Climate change was reducing agricultural productivity while increasing the costs of maintaining the irrigation systems that supported urban populations. Foreign competition was disrupting traditional routes, while new technologies were making local products less competitive in international markets. Internal political divisions were weakening central authority, while external pressures were mounting from multiple directions. Yet achievements during the centuries of greatness had transformed African civilization in ways that would endure long after political independence ended. The metallurgical technology developed in workshops spread throughout sub-Saharan Africa, enabling agricultural and military developments that shaped the continent's subsequent history. The governmental techniques perfected in bureaucracies influenced development in successor states. The artistic traditions created in studios continued to inspire aesthetic development for centuries after the kingdom's decline. Most importantly, the civilization had demonstrated that African societies could achieve levels of sophistication that rivaled anything produced elsewhere in the ancient world. The kingdom's success challenged assumptions about racial and cultural hierarchies that had shaped Mediterranean thought since classical antiquity. Its achievements provided inspiration for later African kingdoms, while preserving cultural traditions that would influence development throughout northeastern Africa for millennia to come. Cleopatra's suicide in Alexandria changed everything. When the last Ptolemaic ruler pressed the asp to her breast rather than face Mediterranean humiliation, she extinguished a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. Augustus Caesar, master of the known world, now gazed south from his newly conquered province toward lands that no legionnaire had ever controlled. Beyond the first cataract lay the Kingdom of Kush, wealthy in gold and fierce in war, ruled by a one-eyed sovereign whose name would echo through history as the woman who dared defy the mightiest power on earth. Kandak commanded the loyalty of desert fighters whose ancestors had conquered pharaohs. From her palace at Meroe, she watched Italian legions establish garrisons along the Nile. while merchants from the peninsula explored commercial opportunities in lands that had enriched Egyptian treasuries for millennia. The new masters of the Mediterranean seemed determined to extend their dominions southward, following patterns established by every conqueror who had ever controlled the northern regions. But these invaders would discover that the kingdom beyond the cataracts differed fundamentally from the docile provinces they had subdued elsewhere. Here ruled a civilization that had never accepted foreign domination, whose soldiers had humbled pharaonic armies, and whose monarchs commanded absolute authority over domains stretching deep into the continental interior. The confrontation that followed would reshape imperial understanding of Africa, while demonstrating that even the mightiest military machine could be forced to negotiate with determined adversaries. The crisis began with taxation. Gaius Petronius, the emperor's appointed governor of Egypt, attempted to extend fiscal policies into the borderlands where tribute had traditionally flowed southward rather than north. His agents appeared at markets throughout the region between the cataracts, demanding payments in silver coin from traders accustomed to conducting business through barter or payment in kind. Local chiefs who had maintained their authority through careful balance between competing interests suddenly found themselves caught between conflicting claims for their allegiance. The sovereign responded with characteristic decisiveness. Rather than protesting through diplomatic channels or seeking accommodation with the new administration, she mobilized 30,000 fighters for a campaign that would demonstrate her military capabilities to the Mediterranean world. Her army represented the culmination of centuries of tactical evolution. Disciplined infantry armed with steel weapons, cavalry trained in desert warfare, siege specialists capable of reducing fortified positions, an engineering corps that could move large forces across the most difficult terrain. The monarch herself led the advance guard that crossed into occupied territory during the late summer of 25 years before the Common Era. Contemporary accounts describe her as a formidable figure despite having lost one eye in earlier conflicts. Tall, commanding, wearing golden armor that proclaimed her divine authority while practical enough to provide real protection in combat. Her personal guard consisted of 200 Amazon fighters, whose prowess with bow and spear had been perfected through years of frontier warfare against tribal raiders and foreign adventurers. The first target was Sienne, modern Aswan, where imperial engineers had established a base for maintaining the river traffic that supplied their southern garrisons. The town's modest fortifications had been designed to deter bandits rather than resist professional assault. The attacking forces surrounded the settlement during the pre-dawn hours, launching coordinated strikes that overwhelmed the defenders before they could organize effective resistance. By midday, southern banners flew from every tower, while Mediterranean survivors stumbled northward, carrying news of the disaster. The psychological impact exceeded the strategic value. The newest province had been invaded successfully by forces whose capabilities had been completely underestimated. The captured town yielded significant booty, military supplies, administrative records that revealed intelligence about southern regions, and prisoners whose interrogation provided valuable information about enemy intentions. Most importantly, the victory demonstrated that expansion could be challenged effectively by adversaries who understood their own terrain and possessed sufficient military skill. But the ruler's greatest triumph was yet to come. Her intelligence network had identified Primis as the key to control over the southern frontier. This fortress city commanded the crucial portage around the first cataract, where all river traffic had to be unloaded, transported overland, and reloaded on different vessels. Its massive stone walls enclosed warehouses, administrative offices, and barracks that housed the garrison responsible for maintaining order throughout the borderlands. The siege became a masterpiece of military engineering. Rather than attempting costly direct assaults against prepared positions, engineers employed diversionary tactics that divided the defenders' attention while concentrating overwhelming force against selected weak points. Tunnels undermined critical sections of the wall, while catapults mounted on mobile platforms provided covering fire for assault troops. Most innovative were the fire ships launched against the enemy flotilla, vessels packed with combustible materials that destroyed naval capabilities within hours. The fortress fell after 18 days of intensive combat. Mediterranean sources, clearly impressed despite their defeat, describe fighting of unprecedented ferocity as southern soldiers scaled walls under arrow fire, engaged defenders in hand-to-hand combat along narrow ramparts, and maintained pressure that never allowed their enemies respite or opportunity to reorganize. When the gates finally splintered under concentrated assault, the attacking forces poured through with disciplined fury that swept aside all resistance. The conqueror's treatment of the captured city revealed sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. Rather than massacring the population or destroying the infrastructure, she conducted ceremonies that emphasized legitimate claims to authority over lands that the invaders had assumed belonged to their Egyptian province. Statues of the emperor were toppled and dragged through the streets in ritual humiliation that symbolically reversed the power relationships between occupier and kingdom. The bronze head of one imperial statue was carried south to Meroe, where it was buried beneath the threshold of a palace so that visitors would literally trample foreign authority underfoot. The sovereign's proclamations during this campaign demonstrated both political sophistication and cultural confidence. Her scribes prepared inscriptions in multiple languages, Meroitic, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and Greek, that announced the restoration of traditional boundaries and the rejection of foreign fiscal demands. These documents emphasized continuity with ancient precedents rather than revolutionary innovation, presenting the conflict as defensive response to aggression rather than unprovoked attack on legitimate authority. News of these defeats reached the capital during the winter months, when Mediterranean sailing was impossible and military response would have to wait for spring. The emperor faced a dilemma that would influence policy for centuries. Direct retaliation required diverting legions from other frontiers, where German tribes, Parthian kingdoms, and Spanish rebels demanded constant attention. Yet allowing these victories to stand unpunished would encourage resistance throughout the dominions, while undermining the prestige that maintained authority over hundreds of different peoples. The response, when it came, reflected both military capabilities and the limitations imposed by distance, terrain, and climate. The general assembled 15,000 infantry and cavalry for a campaign designed to restore prestige while establishing more defensible boundaries. His forces included veteran legions experienced in desert warfare, auxiliary units recruited from Egyptian and Libyan tribes familiar with local conditions, and siege specialists trained in reducing fortified positions under challenging circumstances. The invasion demonstrated tactical superiority in conventional warfare, while revealing the limitations of traditional military methods when applied to these conditions. The legions excelled in set-piece battles, where discipline and superior equipment could overcome larger numbers of less organized opponents. They proved equally effective in siege operations, where engineering skills and systematic approaches could reduce static defenses, but controlling vast regions populated by mobile enemies who could appear suddenly, strike effectively, and disappear into terrain that favored defenders required different capabilities. The assault on Napata, the former capital that retained enormous symbolic importance, exemplified both strengths and adaptability. The city's defenses had been strengthened with innovations learned from observing siege techniques. Multiple walls channeled attacking forces into killing zones commanded by archer positions. Underground passages allowed defenders to strike flanks and rear areas while remaining protected from counterattack. Most effectively, the entire population had been evacuated along with portable wealth, leaving only empty buildings for the invaders to capture. The general achieved tactical victory at enormous cost. His forces succeeded in breaching the walls and occupying the abandoned city, but casualties from the siege exceeded anything experienced in previous operations. More seriously, controlling the captured territory required permanent garrisons that could not be withdrawn without inviting immediate reoccupation. The commander found himself holding static positions in hostile territory, while his enemies retained complete freedom of movement throughout the surrounding region. The decisive engagement came when the defender launched a coordinated attack designed to eliminate the foreign presence entirely. Her strategy involved simultaneous pressure on multiple positions, preventing mutual support while concentrating overwhelming force against isolated detachments. Cavalry struck supply convoys, while infantry surrounded forward outposts. Most devastatingly, engineers succeeded in diverting water sources that supplied the main camp, forcing immediate withdrawal or death from thirst. The commander barely escaped with half his original force intact. The survivors who struggled north across the desert carried tales of an enemy whose capabilities exceeded anything they had encountered in other provinces. These fighters demonstrated professional skill, enhanced by intimate knowledge of terrain that favored mobility over static defense. Their leader commanded loyalty that enabled sustained resistance against odds that would have broken other opponents. Most importantly, they possessed sufficient resources to maintain extended campaigns without depending on external support. Yet the conflict had cost both sides dearly. Imperial prestige throughout the eastern Mediterranean had suffered serious damage as news of these victories spread among populations who had assumed that the legions were invincible. Casualties, though proportionally smaller, included experienced officers and elite troops whose replacement required years of training and recruitment. Economic disruption from military campaigns and territorial devastation threatened the commercial relationships that provided much of the kingdom's wealth. Both rulers recognized that continued warfare served neither side's fundamental interests. The emperor needed stability on his Egyptian frontier to focus attention on more pressing challenges elsewhere in his dominions. The sovereign required peace to consolidate her victories while rebuilding the regions that had suffered during the campaigns. Most importantly, both sides had demonstrated their military capabilities sufficiently to command respectful attention from their adversaries. The negotiations that followed established precedents for relations that would endure for centuries. Rather than meeting in either capital, diplomats convened on the sacred island of Philae, neutral territory that honored both Egyptian traditions and southern sovereignty. The delegation included experienced administrators familiar with frontier management, while the representatives combined military veterans with scribes trained in international law. The resulting treaty represented compromise that satisfied both parties' essential requirements. The Mediterranean power acknowledged independence south of Hera Sykaminos, while retaining control over lands north of that boundary. Tribute payments were eliminated in exchange for commercial agreements that provided luxury goods through regulated channels. Most importantly, both sides agreed to mutual assistance against tribal raiders and other common threats that endangered stability throughout the region. The enforcement mechanisms demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international relations. Exchange of hostages ensured good faith compliance, while regular diplomatic meetings provided forums for resolving disputes before they escalated into armed conflict. Commercial treaties regulated prices and quotas, while preventing the economic manipulation that had triggered the original crisis. Military cooperation agreements established protocols for joint operations against bandit groups and foreign invaders. Cultural exchange flourished under these arrangements. Mediterranean merchants established permanent bases in southern cities, while traders gained access to northern markets previously controlled by Egyptian intermediaries. Technological innovations spread in both directions as engineering techniques improved irrigation systems, while indigenous metallurgical knowledge enhanced weapon production. Artistic influences created hybrid styles that enriched both traditions. The spiritual dimension of this relationship proved particularly significant. Authorities, familiar with Egyptian theological traditions, recognized legitimate claims to divine authority that transcended political boundaries. Rulers, experienced in dealing with foreign systems, found ways to honor Mediterranean traditions while maintaining their own practices. This mutual respect facilitated cooperation that might have been impossible under purely secular arrangements. The sovereign's reign during the post-war period demonstrated the benefits of successful resistance followed by negotiated settlement. Her kingdom experienced unprecedented prosperity as protection secured trade routes while independence preserved traditional governmental systems. Construction projects throughout the realm reflected this wealth. Palaces that incorporated architectural techniques, temples that celebrated indigenous traditions, and public works that served growing urban populations. The ruler's own monuments from this period reveal her understanding of the historical significance of her achievements. Relief carvings show her receiving tribute from various sources, while conducting ceremonies that emphasize divine approval of her policies. Inscriptions proclaim her victories over foreign enemies, while celebrating the peace that her strength had secured. These texts present warfare as necessary evil, that wise leaders employ only when diplomacy fails to protect their people's legitimate interests. Sources from the later 1st century reflect changing attitudes toward capabilities that resulted from this conflict. Writers who had initially dismissed military potential now acknowledged professional competence that commanded respectful attention. Administrative documents reveal efforts to learn from innovations in desert warfare, siege defense, and diplomatic negotiation. Most significantly, strategic planning for other frontiers incorporated lessons learned from confronting an enemy who had successfully challenged expansion. The generation that followed these events witnessed gradual integration of systems that benefited both civilizations. Commercial relationships evolved beyond simple commodity exchange to include technological transfer, educational opportunities, and cultural enrichment. Diplomatic contacts expanded to cover subjects ranging from boundary demarcation to shared responses to climate change. Military cooperation proved effective against common enemies, while building trust between former adversaries. Yet this period of cooperation coincided with internal changes that would ultimately threaten the stability that successful resistance had achieved. Prosperity from northern trade created social groups whose interests sometimes conflicted with traditional authority structures. Technological innovations disrupted established craft production while creating opportunities for entrepreneurs who challenged hereditary privileges. Most significantly, influences from the Mediterranean world began competing with indigenous spiritual traditions for popular loyalty. As the 2nd century of the Common Era progressed, signs of internal strain became increasingly apparent throughout the kingdom. Climate change reduced agricultural productivity, while population growth increased demand for food and resources. External pressures from Ethiopian kingdoms, Arab tribes, and other societies complicated foreign relations while requiring expensive military preparations. Most ominously, interest in direct control over sources threatened the commercial arrangements that had maintained peaceful coexistence. The legacy of resistance would endure long after these challenges overwhelmed the kingdom she had defended so successfully. Her demonstration that military capabilities could challenge expansion influenced strategic thinking throughout the Mediterranean world. The diplomatic precedents established through her negotiations provided models for later rulers who sought to maintain independence while accommodating imperial expansion. Most importantly, her reign proved that determined resistance followed by skillful negotiation could achieve better results than either complete submission or futile defiance. The one-eyed monarch who had dared defy the mightiest power became a symbol of strength that inspired later generations of leaders who faced similar challenges. Her bronze statue, erected in the palace at Meroe, bore inscriptions that proclaimed her achievements while challenging successors to maintain the independence that her courage had preserved. The kingdom she had saved would endure for another 2 centuries, its prosperity and cultural achievements testifying to the wisdom of her policies and the effectiveness of her leadership. As imperial power reached its zenith under Trajan and Hadrian, the memory of this resistance served as reminder that even the mightiest military machine faced limits imposed by geography, culture, and the determination of peoples who refused to accept foreign domination. The woman who had buried the emperor's head beneath her threshold had taught a lesson that would influence policy throughout the continent for generations to come. The last great pyramid stood half-finished, its limestone blocks scattered across the desert like broken teeth. Yesabok Hemani had died before the monument's completion, and his successor lacked the resources to continue the work that had once proclaimed divine authority to the world. Across the kingdom that had humbled pharaohs and defied Caesar, similar scenes of abandonment marked the slow dissolution of a civilization that had flourished for over a millennium. The rot had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly, during the prosperous decades following the treaty with Augustus. Commercial routes that had once poured wealth into palace treasuries began shifting eastward as new maritime technologies made Red Sea shipping more profitable than overland caravans. Ethiopian merchants, operating from highland ports with direct access to Indian Ocean commerce, offered better prices for ivory and exotic goods than middlemen based in the Nile Valley. The monopoly on African luxury products that had funded greatness slowly eroded as competitors discovered alternative supply chains. Climate change accelerated the economic decline. Archaeological evidence reveals a pattern of decreasing rainfall that began around the 2nd century of the Common Era and intensified over the following generations. The seasonal floods that had sustained agriculture throughout the Middle Nile region became increasingly unpredictable. Crops failed with growing frequency, while desert encroachment claimed farmland that had fed urban populations for centuries. The sophisticated irrigation systems that had supported dense settlement required constant maintenance that became prohibitively expensive as tax revenues declined. Amanitarachide, who ruled during the 3rd century, struggled valiantly to arrest the decline through administrative reforms and military campaigns designed to secure alternative sources of revenue. His inscriptions, carved in increasingly simplified writing, reveal a monarch desperately attempting to maintain ceremonies while adapting to reduced circumstances. Construction projects were scaled back dramatically. Palace maintenance was deferred indefinitely. The workshops that had once produced luxury goods for international markets were converted to manufacturing basic necessities for local consumption. The military consequences proved equally severe. The professional army that had defeated legions gradually devolved into poorly equipped militias capable of maintaining order within shrinking territorial boundaries, but unable to project power beyond them. Iron production declined as ore sources became inaccessible and fuel costs increased. The technological advantages that had once given forces decisive superiority over their enemies disappeared, as neighboring peoples acquired similar capabilities through their own commercial networks. Spiritual transformation reflected these material changes. The great sanctuary complexes that had employed thousands of priests, craftsmen, and support personnel could no longer sustain their elaborate ceremonial cycles. Daily offerings were reduced or eliminated entirely. Festival processions that had once attracted pilgrims from across the known world became modest local affairs attended primarily by palace officials and their immediate households. Most significantly, the theological sophistication that had synthesized Egyptian, Mediterranean, and indigenous beliefs gave way to simplified practices that emphasized basic survival rather than cosmic understanding. The written language itself began disappearing from public inscriptions as literacy declined among the administrative classes who had once maintained extensive records. Monuments from the later 3rd century contain increasing numbers of errors in spelling and grammar, suggesting that even palace scribes were losing familiarity with their own writing system. By the 4th century, many official documents were being composed in Egyptian hieroglyphs or Greek letters, rather than the indigenous characters that had once proclaimed cultural independence. Urban decline accompanied political weakness. Archaeological surveys reveal systematic abandonment of residential districts that had once housed prosperous merchant families and skilled craftsmen. The hafir that had supplied water to growing populations were allowed to silt up as communities lacked the organized labor necessary for maintenance. Markets that had once bustled with traders from across 3 continents became quiet bazaars serving only local needs. The cosmopolitan character that had distinguished the capital from provincial centers gradually disappeared as foreign merchants established bases elsewhere. Yet the kingdom's death throes were neither sudden nor uniform. Some regions maintained relative prosperity, even as the central government lost effective control over distant provinces. Local nobles established semi-independent principalities that preserved elements of ancestral culture while adapting to changed circumstances. These successor states continued commercial relationships with Ethiopian kingdoms, Arabian merchants, and Egyptian communities, long after the court had ceased to function as an effective political center. The rise of Christianity introduced another destabilizing element into an already fragile situation. Missionaries from Egypt and Ethiopia brought concepts that challenged beliefs about divine kingship and cosmic order. Early converts included influential merchants and craftsmen whose commercial connections had exposed them to foreign ideas. The new faith offered theological explanations for suffering and uncertainty that seemed more relevant than ancient mythologies designed for times of prosperity and expansion. Karamadoye, among the last rulers whose name appears in contemporary inscriptions, attempted to accommodate these changes through syncretism that combined Christian symbols with iconography. Relief carvings from his brief reign show crosses alongside motifs, suggesting an effort to maintain legitimacy among increasingly diverse populations. However, these compromises satisfied neither conservative traditionalists nor enthusiastic converts, further undermining authority at a time when effective leadership was desperately needed. The final blow came from an unexpected direction. The Kingdom of Aksum, based in the Ethiopian highlands, had been gradually expanding its influence throughout the Red Sea region, while the state weakened. Highland merchants had established posts throughout the Middle Nile Valley, creating commercial networks that bypassed intermediaries. Highland missionaries had converted significant portions of the population to Christianity, creating loyalties that transcended political boundaries. Izana of Aksum, whose reign marked the zenith of his kingdom's power, decided to eliminate the last vestiges of independence through direct military intervention. His forces, equipped with the latest military technology and supported by local allies who had grown dissatisfied with ineffective governance, encountered minimal resistance when they crossed the Blue Nile during the 350s. The invasion was less a conquest than an occupation of territories that had already ceased to function as coherent political entities. The Highland inscription that commemorates this campaign describes the destruction in terms that emphasize the restoration of order rather than foreign conquest. Ezana portrayed himself as a Christian liberator, bringing civilization to regions that had fallen into barbarism under ineffective rulers. His forces demolished the remaining pagan sanctuaries, while establishing churches that proclaimed the triumph of the true faith over ancient superstitions. The palaces were stripped of their treasures before being abandoned to the desert that gradually reclaimed them. Yet the end of political independence did not mean the immediate disappearance of culture. Many elements survived within the framework of Highland rule and later Islamic governance. Artistic practices adapted to serve new patrons while maintaining distinctive characteristics that reflected centuries of independent development. Technological innovations continued to influence craft production throughout the region. Most importantly, the memory of past greatness provided inspiration for later movements that sought to restore African dignity and independence. The fate of the population after the kingdom's collapse remains largely mysterious due to the absence of written records from this transitional period. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities migrated southward into regions that remained beyond Highland control, carrying with them cultural practices that would influence the development of later African societies. Others apparently integrated into the new political order, while maintaining aspects of their ancestral heritage through oral narratives and modified practices. Language survival provides the clearest evidence of cultural continuity. Although the writing system disappeared from public use, the spoken tongue persisted in modified forms that influenced the development of later regional dialects. Linguistic analysis reveals borrowings in several modern languages of the Middle Nile region, suggesting that significant populations of descendants maintained their ancestral speech patterns despite political upheaval and cultural transformation. The economic foundations that had supported civilization were gradually absorbed into broader commercial networks centered on different political entities. Gold mining continued under new management systems that directed profits toward Highland and later Islamic treasuries rather than indigenous courts. Iron production techniques spread throughout the region as knowledge that had once been concentrated in workshops became available to independent craftsmen. Routes that had once converged on the capital were redirected toward Highland centers that offered better access to Red Sea shipping. Archaeological investigation of the abandoned capital reveals the material conditions of decline in vivid detail. Excavations in the palace district show evidence of systematic stripping, followed by gradual collapse as mud brick structures succumbed to wind erosion and occasional flash floods. The sanctuary complexes were deliberately destroyed through careful dismantling that suggests organized salvage operations rather than random vandalism. Industrial areas show signs of abandonment rather than destruction, indicating that craftsmen gradually departed rather than suffering violent displacement. The pyramid fields provide the most poignant testimony to the kingdom's end. The latest tombs show dramatic reductions in scale and quality compared to earlier monuments. Burial goods become increasingly modest, while inscriptions grow shorter and less sophisticated. Several unfinished pyramids mark the point where resources were no longer available to complete burial projects, that had once rivaled anything produced by earlier pharaohs. Yet even in decline, the civilization demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. Communities that could no longer support monumental architecture channeled their creative energies into portable crafts that maintained aesthetic values while serving practical needs. Practices evolved to accommodate new theological concepts while preserving elements of ancestral spirituality. Political organization adapted to function within larger imperial frameworks while maintaining local autonomy in matters that affected daily life. The transformation, during its final centuries, anticipated patterns that would characterize much of African history during subsequent millennia. Indigenous institutions proved capable of surviving political conquest and cultural pressure through strategic adaptation that preserved essential elements while modifying superficial characteristics. Leadership structures evolved to function within foreign governmental systems, while maintaining legitimacy among local populations. Beliefs synthesized external influences with ancestral concepts to create hybrid systems that served both spiritual and social needs. The legacy extended far beyond the political boundaries of the historical kingdom. Technological innovations developed in workshops influenced craft production throughout sub-Saharan Africa as knowledge spread through migration and commercial contact. Artistic practices established during the classical period continued to inspire aesthetic development in later societies that traced their cultural ancestry to the Nile Valley kingdoms. Most importantly, the historical example of successful African state building provided inspiration for later political movements that sought to establish indigenous governmental systems. The rediscovery of achievements by modern archaeological investigation has revealed the extent to which this civilization influenced broader patterns of African development. Excavations at sites throughout the former kingdom have uncovered evidence of sophisticated urban planning, advanced metallurgical techniques, and complex commercial relationships that challenge earlier assumptions about pre-colonial African capabilities. These findings have transformed scholarly understanding of both ancient and medieval African history, while providing contemporary African societies with historical precedents for their own developmental aspirations. The story of decline and disappearance serves as a reminder that even the most successful civilizations face challenges that can overwhelm their adaptive capabilities. Environmental change, economic disruption, political fragmentation, and cultural transformation combined to create pressures that exceeded the kingdom's capacity for effective response. Yet the manner of this civilization's end also demonstrates the resilience of human communities when faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As the sun set over the abandoned pyramids, it illuminated ruins that would inspire wonder and curiosity for centuries to come. The kingdom that had once challenged pharaohs and defied Caesar had passed into history, but its achievements remained embedded in the cultural practices of the peoples who inherited its legacy. The dream of African greatness that had first taken shape in the workshops of Kerma and reached its zenith in the palaces of Napata would endure through the darkest periods of foreign domination to inspire new movements toward independence and dignity. The final inscription, carved in the indigenous writing system, discovered in the ruins of a sanctuary at Musawarat Sufra, bears a simple message that summarizes both the achievements and the ultimate fate of this remarkable civilization. The gods remember what humans forget. In those words lies both an epitaph for a lost kingdom and a prophecy of its eventual rediscovery by peoples who would once again appreciate the grandeur of Africa's classical age. The desert wind swept across the ruins as George Reisner's excavation team carefully brushed sand from a golden amulet that had lain buried for 15 centuries. The year was 1920, and the Harvard archaeologist was uncovering treasures that would revolutionize understanding of the continent's past. Each artifact that emerged from the soil told a story that contradicted everything European scholars had believed about the Dark Continent. Here were technologies that rivaled those of Greece and Rome, art that surpassed the finest Mediterranean works, and evidence of political sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial capabilities. The rediscovery of this lost realm began not with academic curiosity, but with imperial ambition. When British forces under Herbert Kitchener conquered Sudan in 1898, military engineers surveying the newly acquired territory encountered massive stone ruins that local inhabitants called the cities of the ancients. These crumbling monuments bore hieroglyphic inscriptions in scripts that no living person could read, yet their scale and sophistication suggested a society of remarkable accomplishments. Early European explorers approached these ruins with preconceptions shaped by centuries of racial prejudice and colonial propaganda. The magnificent pyramids that dotted the landscape from Kuru to Meroe were initially attributed to Egyptian colonists or mysterious white settlers who had somehow enlightened the indigenous population before vanishing into obscurity. The possibility that black inhabitants had independently created such monuments seemed inconceivable to minds conditioned by social Darwinist theories about evolution and racial hierarchy. But the evidence refused to conform to these expectations. Excavations at Kerma revealed urban planning that predated most European cities by millennia. The fortress walls and sophisticated pottery challenged narratives about primitive societies, unchanged by development. Most shocking of all, inscriptions began emerging that depicted black pharaohs ruling the northern kingdom itself, a reversal of colonial assumptions about the natural order of power. The decipherment of hieroglyphic texts from Jebel Barkal and other sites gradually revealed the true scope of what had been lost. Here was documentation of military campaigns that had conquered the world's greatest powers, treaties negotiated between kingdoms and Mediterranean empires, commercial records that detailed trade networks spanning 3 continents, royal proclamations that demonstrated governmental sophistication matching anything produced by classical antiquity. Francis Llewellyn Griffith's breakthrough in reading the indigenous script opened new vistas of understanding. The cursive writing system that had recorded the thoughts and accomplishments of monarchs for over 1,000 years began yielding its secrets to patient scholarship. Royal inscriptions proclaimed divine authority in language that echoed pharaonic customs while asserting distinctly regional perspectives on kingship and cosmic order. Commercial documents revealed economic relationships that had connected the heart of the continent with markets from India to the Atlantic coast. Each season of excavation brought fresh revelations that forced revision of established narratives. The finding of iron-working furnaces at Meroe predated similar methods in much of Europe, suggesting that the region had been a center of innovation rather than a recipient of foreign knowledge. Artistic masterpieces demonstrated aesthetic sensibilities that synthesized influences from across the world while maintaining distinctly local characteristics. Political monuments revealed governmental systems that had successfully balanced central authority with regional autonomy across vast territories and diverse populations. The implications extended far beyond academic research. During the decades when European colonial powers were justifying their domination through claims about superiority, these findings provided compelling evidence of indigenous accomplishments that rivaled or exceeded anything produced elsewhere. The kingdom that had humbled pharaohs and negotiated as equals with emperors challenged fundamental assumptions about racial capabilities and social development. Intellectuals and political leaders seized upon these revelations as powerful tools in their struggles for independence and dignity. Marcus Garvey incorporated images of black pharaohs into his Back to Africa movement, arguing that these findings proved capabilities for self-governance and excellence. Kwame Nkrumah referenced the inheritance in his writings about unity and pan-continental identity. Leopold Senghor drew inspiration from excavation results for his philosophy of negritude that celebrated distinctly continental contributions to world progress. The impact on academic scholarship proved equally transformative. Historians who had previously dismissed the continent as a land without significant development were forced to acknowledge evidence of state formation, innovation, and excellence that predated similar developments elsewhere. Anthropologists had to revise theories about social evolution that had assumed societies represented earlier stages of human progress. Art historians found aesthetic movements that influenced development throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. But the most profound transformation occurred in consciousness itself. Generations of colonial education had taught children that their ancestors had contributed nothing to world progress beyond primitive crafts and tribal customs. The finding of pyramids built by local hands, methods developed in regional workshops, and empires ruled by indigenous monarchs provided a completely different narrative about continental heritage and human potential. Educational curricula throughout newly independent nations began incorporating these findings into their national narratives. Sudanese schools taught children about Paye's conquest of the north and Amanirenas' resistance to Rome as examples of courage and capability. Ethiopian institutions emphasized connections between ancient societies and contemporary identity. Universities across the continent established departments that trained local scholars to continue the work of rediscovery and interpretation. The artistic renaissance that accompanied political independence drew heavily on excavation revelations for inspiration and legitimacy. Sculptors created works that incorporated motifs from royal monuments. Architects designed public buildings that echoed the proportional systems developed in palaces. Writers crafted novels and poems that imagined the daily lives of people who had created these remarkable societies. Musicians composed symphonies that attempted to capture the grandeur of forgotten kingdoms. Modern research techniques continued revealing new dimensions of accomplishment and complexity. Carbon dating confirmed that ironworking had developed independently and often earlier than similar methods elsewhere. Chemical analysis of pottery revealed trade networks that had connected the continent with Asia centuries before similar commercial relationships developed in Europe. Computer modeling of irrigation systems demonstrated engineering capabilities that had supported urban populations larger than most contemporary cities. The study of women's roles in these societies provided particularly important insights for contemporary feminism. The finding that queens had ruled in their own right, commanded armies, and conducted international diplomacy challenged both patriarchal systems and Western assumptions about gender roles in past societies. The Kandakes became symbols of female empowerment that inspired modern women's movements throughout the continent. Yet the inheritance extended far beyond symbolic inspiration. Modern governments found practical applications for knowledge in their development planning. Irrigation techniques provided models for contemporary agricultural projects. Indigenous metallurgical knowledge informed modern mining operations. Excavation sites became sources of tourist revenue that helped finance national development while preserving heritage for future generations. The international community gradually recognized the significance of these findings for understanding human progress more broadly. UNESCO designated multiple sites as World Heritage locations, acknowledging their universal importance for human heritage. International museums began returning artifacts that had been removed during colonial periods, recognizing claims to patrimony. Academic conferences brought together scholars from around the world to discuss the implications for broader understanding. However, the work of rediscovery and preservation faced ongoing challenges. Political instability in Sudan complicated research while threatening the physical integrity of sites. Limited funding restricted the scope of investigations while preventing adequate conservation measures. Most seriously, the construction of modern dams threatened to flood locations that contained irreplaceable information about human development. Climate change posed additional threats to preservation efforts. Increasing desertification endangered sites that had survived for millennia in stable environmental conditions. Flash flooding, caused by changing weather patterns, damaged excavations and monuments. Rising temperatures accelerated the deterioration of organic materials that provided crucial information about daily life in past times. Despite these challenges, new generations of scholars continued expanding knowledge of their continental heritage. Researchers trained at universities in Khartoum, Cairo, and Addis Ababa brought fresh perspectives to the interpretation of evidence that earlier generations had viewed through colonial or European lenses. Their work revealed continuities that connected past accomplishments with contemporary societies, demonstrating that the inheritance of these societies remained alive in modern practices. The digital revolution opened new possibilities for preserving and sharing this heritage. Virtual reality reconstructions allowed people worldwide to experience the grandeur of palaces and temples. Online databases made findings accessible to researchers and students regardless of their geographic location. Social media platforms enabled communities to celebrate their heritage while educating global audiences about accomplishments that had been systematically ignored or misrepresented. Contemporary genetics research provided another dimension of connection between past and modern populations. DNA analysis revealed that the builders of pyramids and creators of iron methods were indeed the ancestors of current populations, definitively refuting racist theories about mysterious vanished societies. These findings strengthened arguments for the return of artifacts, while reinforcing claims to historical accomplishments. The influence of these findings on contemporary political thought cannot be overstated. Leaders across the continent referenced excavation results in their arguments for unity, development, and pride. The Union adopted symbols that deliberately echoed imagery while proclaiming continuity between past accomplishments and future aspirations. Development policies increasingly emphasized the revival of indigenous methods and governmental systems that had proven successful in contexts. Educational institutions throughout the diaspora incorporated these findings into curricula designed to counteract centuries of negative stereotyping and alienation. Schools in Brazil taught students about kingdoms that had influenced world development. Universities in the United States established studies programs that emphasized accomplishments rather than victimization. Community organizations throughout the Caribbean used evidence to strengthen arguments for reparations and recognition. The inheritance also influenced contemporary discussions about global development and exchange. The revelation that the continent had been a center of innovation and international commerce challenged narratives about European superiority that had justified colonialism and continued economic exploitation. The success of states in managing ethnic diversity and environmental challenges provided models for addressing contemporary problems that seemed distinctly modern. As the 21st century progressed, new findings continued revealing additional dimensions of accomplishment and complexity. Excavations at sites throughout Sudan and Ethiopia uncovered evidence of scientific knowledge, artistic sophistication, and political innovation that expanded understanding of human capabilities in pre-modern societies. Each find reinforced arguments about the continent's central role in human development, while providing inspiration for contemporary efforts to restore dignity and prosperity. The boy who had knelt in prayer beneath Jebel Barkal before marching north to claim the throne had become a symbol of human potential that transcended racial and boundaries. The woman who had buried Caesar's bronze head beneath her palace threshold represented the possibility of successful resistance to overwhelming odds through courage, intelligence, and determination. The craftsmen who had forged steel in workshops demonstrated that innovation knew no geographic or ethnic limitations. Their accomplishments reminded the modern world that progress had many centers and many expressions, that human creativity flourished wherever communities were allowed to develop according to their own genius and circumstances. The rediscovery of their inheritance challenged everyone to reconsider assumptions about development, racial capabilities, and causation, while providing hope that contemporary problems might be solved through the same combination of vision, courage, and practical wisdom that had created the magnificent kingdoms. The desert wind that swept across the ruins carried with it not just sand and memories, but the promise of continued finding and renewed appreciation for accomplishments that had shaped human development in ways the world was only beginning to understand. The story of rediscovery had become part of the inheritance itself, demonstrating that truth eventually emerges despite centuries of suppression, and that human accomplishments, once created, can never be completely destroyed.